Episode 281, The Future. This is The Change Underground. I'm your host, John Moore. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. It has rightly been said that prediction is a difficult business, especially about the future. But let's not worry too much about that and we'll have a crack. There are things occurring in this world that raise concerns. Fear not, dear listener, this is not about the Illuminati or any other conspiracy theory. Today I wish to look with cold reason upon some price changes over the past 6 months or even 12 months, and commodity production figures and some near-term climate forecasts. So with the ground rules established, let's dive in. As I discussed back in episode 279, Cuba suffered a sudden loss of chemical fertilisers after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They also lost their oil imports too, a double blow to the economy. They worked their way through that disaster to become masters of vermiculture and able to feed themselves at the same time. Why do I bring this up? Well, fertiliser prices are having the same effect, if not in scale but in character. From the Chemical and Engineers News is a graph showing anhydrous ammonia, a nitrogen fertiliser, rising in price from just over $500 a tonne in January, on the 14th of January 2021, to being somewhat north of $1,300 a tonne on November 4th, 2021, a roughly 260% increase in cost to the farmer. In the EU, farm fuel costs have risen 174% this year, and fertiliser prices by 37.8%. And the World Bank blog shows different fertilisers at near record highs. The last time prices were higher was in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2007-8. This led, not surprisingly, to food riots across the developing world. From waterpartnership.org.au, a piece entitled Learning from the 2008 Food Crisis. What happened, lesson learned, and ongoing consequences. Quote, in 2007 and 2008, world food prices jumped rapidly, primarily affected staple commodities such as rice, wheat, corn and soybean, which left the poor in many countries vulnerable, end quote. And from the website Trading Economics, we have a graph showing the wheat price rising from just under $500 a bushel at the start of the year to $799 a bushel at the end of the year. All these graphs are available for viewing over at the website under episode 281 in the blog, along with the transcript. So we have a situation across the globe where several factors are colliding. Rising fertiliser prices, as discussed back in 279, because of rising natural gas prices. We have rising food prices, as exemplified by the wheat price, which will in all likelihood transform into higher food prices. Here in Australia, after decades of on-again, off-again, but mostly on-again droughts, this year looked good for wheat farmers. Rain on both sides of the continent at planting, droughts in the Northern Hemisphere restricting supply and rising prices. I say it looked good because flooding rains in October and November have destroyed the quality of much of the harvest, which is in progress. The effect will be to lower returns to many growers, lower the price of feed wheat, and further restrict the supply of wheat for bread, pasta and beer across the globe, which will of course put the price even higher. It's not just staples. The coffee price has risen from under $120 a pound to over $244 US a pound this year. All this data is pointing in one direction, rises in the cost of food for consumers. When I say consumers, I mean people. Remember the old story, when you need a lawyer a few times in your life, a preacher not many more, but a farmer 3 times a day. 2 if things are crook, and 1 if the ship really hits the sandbar. Nowadays, famines caused by crop failures are rare. Nearly all have a political element. Think Yemen today, Bengal during World War II, Ukraine during the 1920s and so on. The Live Aid appeal back in the 80s to meet an African famine raised plenty of money. But I recall hearing the Geldof kitty complaining that lack of roads and trucks were the biggest problem once the food started to flow. Now, in the developed world, there will be some indulged, precocious child somewhere for whom Christmas will have been ruined because a particular gadget didn't arrive in time from China or Vietnam or Bangladesh or wherever, because the world is in a supply chain crisis. From Business Insider Australia comes a piece entitled "Where the Supply Chain Crisis Came From, Where It's Going and When Will It Be Over?" Quote, "Supply chain disruption started more than a year ago as governments and corporations' responses to COVID-19 created a million small interruptions. That, combined with an exploding consumer demand, especially in the developed world," I added that, "is a recipe for a transportation bottleneck in the form of port backlogs that created the famous line of cargo ships off the California coast. As importers try to shove more goods through that bottleneck, it gets worse. The backlog and the mess of factory closures, labour issues and equipment shortages behind it all has been deemed the everything shortage or the supply chain crisis." End quote. And this is mostly about things. Imagine what's likely to occur once food staples are held up in the bottlenecks. Add to this a labour shortage in the supply chain. An example would be the UK running out of truck drivers. Now, I know there's a Brexit effect in that. It turns out when you toss Johnny Foreigner out, Tommy won't always do the crappier jobs that are no longer filled. Who'd have thunk it? Anyway, I believe as a long-term reader of history, even though my degree is in archaeology, that more is afoot. From our worldindata.org, coronavirus-data, we have reported cases worldwide sitting at around 265 million and reported deaths from COVID-19 at 5.25 million. I suspect these figures are a large underestimate, but my hypothesis still holds at these levels. The deaths are being reflected in the loss of people in that supply chain we all rely upon, from farmers and factories to homes. When the Black Death swept through Europe with an admittedly higher fatality rate, upwards of 40%, maybe even 70%, societies underwent dislocations and reorderings that lasted for centuries. We are nowhere near the same level of loss, thankfully, but the effects are still rippling through the world's societies as we are still dealing with the continuing pandemic. An MI5 report, that's the British Internal Security Service, spy agency if you like, as quoted in the HuffPost of 17th of August 2011, suggested that the UK is only 4 missed meals from anarchy. The idea of ships full of food sitting outside harbours as the inhabitants of those harbour cities riot due to food shortages is not the future we need. Now, I'll admit altogether not the rosiest of word pictures I've painted, but one I think we need to face. It is time, I think, for Bill Mollison's 10% to move from consumption to production rule to kick in. In the southern hemisphere, next winter looks like a time to watch, and in the north that depends upon Russian gas supplies, Ukrainian wheat production, and the actions of the Chinese Communist Party, as well as the continued El Nino across North America. Africa is such a mixed bag of possibilities, I'm unwilling to even guess when that might come to a head. Not surprisingly, I would suggest we all grow as much of our own food as we can. The Cubans came through their hungry years with a better system and I suspect healthier people for a while. And we can too. We can even avoid the hungry years if we shorten our supply lines. Speak to our neighbours, join community gardens, start an allotment, plant a window box, anything really. Just start. And you know the drill. If you need help, there's a free ebook at the World Organic News website and the No Dig gardening courses there too, links in the show notes. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.